first thing that we're going to do is create a new graph. So let's come over here to our Substance package, right click and choose New Substance Graph. I'm going to choose Physically Based Metallic Roughness, and for this name here, I'm going to call this wood underscore planks aged. I'm going to leave this size mode set to relative to parent, and I'm going to leave this working resolution set at 1024. So we'll click OK, and here we have a new empty graph. Now this graph has our outputs because this graph is going to represent the full material that we'll be creating throughout the rest of this course. Now I'm going to paste in some frames that I created that's going to help me to describe the approach we're going to take to creating this material. So I want to start with grayscale and then work towards color. So here in this grayscale section, you can see that we're going to start with basic shapes. Then we're going to move into large to medium shapes, and then we're going to kind of work our way down into smaller details. And all of this work is going to create for us this height map. Once we have the height map, we're then going to be able to extrapolate maps such as our normal, ambient occlusion, and roughness. Once we have our height, normal, AO, and rough, we will then have the overall description of the surface attributes of the material. From there, we can simply just colorize our information to create our base color map. All of these maps are going to be routed into a base material, which is then going to allow us to move into the material blending phase, where we can then start to layer different materials such as moss, dirt, and water. Finally, after the material blending, we then have our full outputs here such as normal, ambient occlusion, roughness, metallic, base color, and height. So as I said, we're going to start with grayscale, and let's first take a look at creating these basic shapes. All right, so let's start here with our basic shapes. So let me just grab this frame, and we're just going to move this guy up into an empty area. And like I said, we're going to start kind of in this section. So I'm also going to come over here to my planks, and I'm just going to drag this here into my basic shapes. So here we have our planks. Now, one thing I changed and I want to mention, notice that I dragged this planks in. You'll see that, well, I actually see the planks, and that's because I reordered these outputs. So the thumbnail that gets produced is the first output that you see. So if you come over here to the planks graph, so let's double click to enter that, you can see that I have these outputs. And here in my base parameters underneath output images, we can actually just left click and drag on the left side of one of these outputs and just reorder it as you see here. So all I've done is I've taken the planks and just placed it at the top, so that planks thumbnail is going to render for me. So let's go back here to this wood planks and again continue to work on our basic shape. Here I have my planks, and what I'd like to do is just add a warp. So we're going to add a warp, and let's take our planks and put this here into the input. And now I'm going to need a gradient input, and for that I'm going to use a noise. I'm going to use this Perlin noise 1. And so we'll put this here into the gradient input. So double click to view this into the 2D view. Way too intense, so let's come over here to our parameters and drop this intensity quite a bit. So we're just going to do something kind of subtle like this. So we're just kind of warping these planks a bit. And like I said, this is going to represent our basic shape here. So the next stage of this is we want to start to work on our large and medium shape details. So let me just grab this frame here and bring this up to this portion of the graph, and we'll start working on our large and medium shapes. So the first thing I'm going to create is like a planing effect. So let me show you what I mean by that. We're going to come in here and grab a slope blur, and I'm going to take the result of this warp here and plug that into the grayscale input. And I'll go ahead and set the samples to 32 and the mode to min, and I'll probably just lower the intensity to start. Now we need a slope. So here I'm going to grab another noise, and I'm going to choose this Perlin noise zoom. So with this guy here created, we're going to plug this here into our slope. Let's double click our slope blur, and here you can see the result. Now the first thing we're going to do is come back to this distance here for this Perlin noise zoom and just decrease this quite a bit, because I want some more kind of large type shapes like this. And then we'll come back here to our intensity. I'm just going to increase this intensity so I can talk about what I meant here by this planes. So what I'm doing here with this Perlin noise zoom is I'm dividing these planks up into individual planes. So for example, you can see that right here we kind of have like this kind of flat plane, and then it kind of slopes down. So here's another plane. Here if we look, we got a flat plane and then an angle plane here. and so on. So you can see this again here with this this plane, and then another slope angle plane here. And so kind of going back to that ZBrush reference, this is like if I were to, you know, take, again, working on my large forms, I take like the triplanar brush and I start to kind of plane up some geometric shapes here to these planks that I'm creating. And in a case like this, again, talking about that ZBrush reference, this is when we're kind of at a lower subdivision level because we're working on these large medium type shapes. So this is kind of intense, and of course we could control this here with this intensity value, but what I'm going to do is kind of blend this back over top of its original self, or that original warp. So here I'll create a blend, and we're going to take the result here of this slope blur into the foreground, and then we're going to grab our warp here into the background, and then I'm just going to simply decrease the opacity here to kind of back this off. So here's kind of the result that I'm getting so far. And here I might go back to that slope blur and just play around here with that distance. So now I feel like I'm getting you know, a bit sharper lines here on these planes. And this is, again, more of kind of what I was thinking. Here it's even more clear. We've got, again, a plane, slope angle plane here, and so on. So now that that's set, we need to really start thinking about visualizing what we're doing so far here in our 3D view. So I'm going to create here a base material, just as we've been doing in these previous graphs. And for the material preset, we're going to change this to dielectric. We'll increase our roughness, and then I'm going to enable here my normal and my height. So now I need to generate my normal height information. Well, I already have my normal here, so let's just plug that. I'm sorry, I already have my height, so let's just plug that into the height. So now I'm going to create a normal node here. And I'll set this force alpha to 1, and let's take our height output and plug this here into the normal, and then maybe set a value of something like, say, 5 to start. And then we'll plug this here into our normal. So we just want to view this base material, so we can right-click this node and drag and drop it here into our 3D view, and here we start to get the result of this height that we've created thus far. Now I also want to change my shader, so materials, I'm going to come over here to my definitions and the physically based metal rough shader, make sure that this is set to tessellation, and then we'll increase our scale value to something like, say, 2. So it's you know, real chunky, so let's tessellate this guy up a bit. So now we can see kind of what the result of this height is really doing here as we on this tessellated mesh. All right, so let's just kind of move these guys out of the way, and we're going to continue working here on these large and medium shapes. So I think another thing I'd like to do is try to create an effect where I've got a little bit of bowing or warping here on these planks. And so I'm going to do that by producing an edge mask. And so an easy way to do that, first off, I'm going to grab an edge detect node here, and then I'm going to take my original warp and plug that here into the edge detect. And I'm going to try to decrease this edge width here. We want this to be fairly low, so let's just bring this all the way down here to 1. And maybe we might need to increase the tolerance a bit, we'll see. And then we're also going to adjust our edge roundness. So here, as I drop the edge roundness, we're starting to get some holes. So here, let's try adjusting that with our tolerance. Not quite cutting it for us. So again, I'll just increase this edge roundness until that disappears. That's going to give me this kind of outline here. And so then what I'm going to do is I'm going to blur this, and I'm going to use this high quality grayscale blur. So we're going to blur this guy, and we'll be able to use this intensity as a control here in a bit. And now in order to create the edge matte, all I have to do is actually create a blend here. That's what I want to do. And we're going to take the blur and place that here into the foreground. And then we're going to take that original edge detect and place that into the background. And then on the blend, I can switch this to subtract. And this creates for me this kind of inner edge matte. And I can go back to the blur, and I can adjust the amount of this edge matte just by adjusting the intensity value here. So this is kind of the start of what I want to create here with this edge matte. And you can notice that if we were to now take this and blend that over top of what we have here, we can get some of this curling. So let's do that right now. Let's come over here and take a blend, and let's take our edge matte in the foreground, and let's take the result of this blend here into the background. And for the blending mode, we'll set this to add, and then we'll just reconnect this here to our base material. Instead of connecting this one by one as a shortcut, I can hold down the shift key, left click this output, and then just redistribute the connection wires this way. And so by doing that, you can see that I'm starting to get kind of this bowing effect here. Now, one other thing that I think I want to do with this, though, is right now it's pretty uniform because we just have this edge mat going around all sides of each one of these planks. And I'd really like to kind of focus this maybe more on one edge. So to do that, I'm going to create a levels node here. And then I'm going to take the output of my warp here into the levels node. And since that original plank pattern has some of this contrast, or excuse me, luminance variation built into it, I can just run a levels here to really just focus or pull out kind of like these highlighted areas. And then I can adjust kind of like a feather amount here just by making some changes here to that gamma. So this right now is focusing a mat just on the edge of one side of here of these planks. So now I'm going to take this and I'm going to combine it here with my original edge mat. So here we'll put this blend in the foreground and our levels here into the background, and then we'll just change our blending mode to multiply. And now you can see that it takes that edge mat and just places it here just on one edge. So now it's kind of a non-uniform. And then we can adjust our levels here to control the amount of this. So here we'll increase the contrast maybe, or decrease it. We can use this input black to adjust just how much of this edge is going to be raised in our height map. So here I'll adjust my gamma towards the input white to kind of really feather this off. And now what we'll do is use this output of this blend effect as our foreground here. So double click and you can see that now this is placing that kind of highlighted value here in our height map just on one side of the edge of the plank. And when we look, we can see that here we're starting to get just a little bit of this kind of curling or bowing here on each one of these planks. And so here at this stage, this is going to take care of our large and our medium shapes. All right, so next, let's come back here to our frames. Again, we just got to make some more room here in our graph. So let's move our base material down. And now we're going to focus on creating our small details. So let's bring this guy up here into view and kind of expand this. And like I said, small details. So going back to kind of that ZBrush reference, this is now where we're going to take our model and we're going to subdivide down a few more levels so that we can get some higher frequency, kind of the smaller type details. And in this case, we're going to start to kind of chip in on these edges. Right now, they're super clean. So we want to kind of tear this up a bit. So the first thing I'm going to do for this is I'm going to grab a slope blur grayscale, and we're going to grab the output here of this blend. And let's just, while we're here, we'll set the samples up and we're going to switch this mode to min. So now I need to create some type of slope. Basically, this is, well, typically I'll say this is going to be like a noise. And so in my case, though, what I'm going to use is this utility node I have down here called the Environment Toolkit. So I'm going to bring this guy here into my graph. Now, this Environment Toolkit is really just a utility node that I created that just houses a lot of different types of noise and effects that I typically find myself creating time and time again. So what I did was I just kind of wrapped all this into a utility node. You can find the Environment Toolkit for free on Substance Share. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the type here from facet edges here to these warped slopes. And so now this is the noise that it's generating for me. So you can see I've got some controls and I can generate this without having to, manually, recreate this effect every single time. So now I'll just take down my edge sharpness and maybe this intensity just a little bit. Get something more like this. And before we make too many changes, let's just integrate this here into our slope blur so we can really see what this is doing for us. So here's the effect that it's creating. We wanted to decrease our intensity. And so as you can see, like I mentioned, this is just kind of cutting in here into these edges. And that's really kind of what we want to do with this. And like I said, this is small detail. Also, on some of our planes, you can see where it's now starting to break up the edges on some of our planes. So if we look, this is what we had before. It's very clean. Everything's very clean. And now the result is we start to just eat in or kind of damage some of this edge here. And like I said, we can come back and start to kind of mess around with some of these values to these warp slopes now that we can kind of visualize what this is doing here on the slope blur. So let me just make a few changes here. Maybe something like this will work. And now let's kind of visualize this here in our 3D view. So once again, I'm just going to hold down the Shift key, left click that output that's connecting to our base material and just redistribute that connection. And so here we can see the result of what's happening here in our 3D view. Now, one thing I want to change here is, well, we have our normal map, but we also have that same amount of high frequency detail being placed into our height map, and that's something that I do not want to do. Like I've been saying, the height map is going to represent kind of the overall kind of large form silhouette shapes, or the silhouette of the shape, and then all that high frequency detail is reserved here for my normal map. So what I'm going to do is maybe come back over to, let's say, perhaps this shape here, and I'm actually going to grab a blur. So I'll grab a high quality blur, and let's plug this guy into here, and then let's just decrease this intensity. So all I want to do is just, blur it just a bit here on these edges. And so you can see this is much more clean, but this height map just contains kind of these larger form details. And I'm going to feed this here into my height map. So when I do that, you can see that, well, we still get a lot of that kind of crunchy detail in our normal, but now some of that high frequency is now devoid from the height, which reduces the overall noise here. And so that's kind of what I'm looking for. We'll keep messing with this as we go as we move further throughout the material. All right, so now this is kind of our first stage, and we've got a lot more work to do here on our small details. So let's see, what I'm going to do next is multiply another noise into here. And for this, I'm going to use my environment toolkit again. So I'm going to bring another instance of this node here, and I'm actually going to use these facet edges. And I'm going to take my distance, and I'm going to set this here to 1. And then I'm going to grab a blend, and I'm going to take the output here into the foreground, and then I'm going to grab my slope blur and place that in the background, and then just do a multiply here. Now I'm going to adjust the opacity quite a bit. So now you can see that I'm just, again, adding some finer planes here to each one of these planks. Here we're going to hold down the Shift key, left click and drag to just reorder the output here. So now that information is being fed over to our normal map. However, our height map is still pretty clean at this point. All right, so here's what we have thus far. Now, one other thing with this, I've got this shape that I have, and I'm just multiplying it down here over top of our planks, and I'd like these shapes to kind of try to conform a bit more to that underlying kind of plank pattern that we have. And so a typical trick to do that is to use a directional warp and feed in an intensity map. Well, in the environment toolkit, since that's something I do often, I have this kind of control already built in. So I'm going to come over here to my pattern, randomize, and warp and enable this. And this gives me an input. So what I'm going to do is just come all the way back here to that original warp and then just plug that into my input. And so now this is going to give me a completely different kind of look here. And all of these kind of faceted shapes now are being directionally warped based on this input here of my planks and that luminance variation that's built into that pattern. So now we have, like I said, a kind of a different pattern look to this. And so here's what it looks like here in our 3D view. Once again, I'd like to mention that this is not showing up here in our height at all. Okay, so now that we have that in place, we want to start adding some even more finer details here. So the next thing I'm going to do is come over here to my wood pattern, my graph, and I'm going to just left click and drag and drop this guy here into my graph. And so we have our 3 outputs. The one we're going to use first here is this cracks. So here I'm going to hit my blend, grab a blend here, and we're going to take our cracks into the foreground, and then we're going to take the result of this blend and place that into the background, and then for our blending mode we're going to multiply this down. So now when we take a look at what we have here, and of course we're going to adjust our opacity on this. So now you'll notice that, well, we have this wood pattern, and essentially all we're doing here is just kind of overlaying or just placing this right on top of this pattern using this multiply node. And by doing this, it looks very uniform in the sense that these cracks, you can see they just follow perfectly as they're not being warped by this underlying plank pattern. So really these planks, they'd be rotated in different directions and so on, and none of these cracks or none of this wood grain would actually be kind of lining up the way it is. So what we can do is, like I said before, we can directionally warp this. And so now I'm going to show you how to manually do that. So here we're going to grab a directional warp, and I'm going to plug my cracks here into the input, and then we're going to use this same warped version of our plank output. So instead of kind of navigating all the way back, I can kind of borrow that connection here from the environment toolkit where it's being used. So I'm going to hold down the control key, left click this output to just borrow a connection line, and then plug that here into this intensity input for that directional warp. And so we'll double click, and here you can see the result here in our 2D view. So now let's take this and implement that here into our blend, and now we'll double click the blend so we can view it. So now what we want to do is just adjust our intensity so we can offset this. So you can see that as I start to adjust my intensity, the directional blur intensity is being driven by the luminance variation here of this Planck pattern. So now all I have to do is just, adjust the intensity enough until these crack lines are just offset and they don't look like they're lining up as well. And so here you can see some of them are getting larger, some of them are smaller, and so on. So it's just, again, a way to quickly kind of vary the composite result of this blend. So now what we're going to do is just kind of drop our opacity down. And once again here, we're just going to connect this over to our base material. So the output is going to go right here into the normal. And so now you can see we're starting to slowly start to build up this wood. And so here is the result we have so far from our height and our normal information. But we're not done yet. We're going to add just another detail. Again, when we're creating these procedural materials, it's all about, subtle variation, and the more variation we can use, the more realistic the result that we can get. So we're going to just layer in another noise on top of this. Luckily, we've already created this noise, and it's part of our wood pattern here. So if we look at our actual wood, here, let's go down to the pattern piece. You can see now we're going to integrate this here into our small details. So here, we're going to take this wood pattern and put this here into the foreground, and then we're going to take the result of this blend here into the background. Double click to view it in the 2D view and set the blending mode here to multiply. Once again, we're going to drop our opacity down. And then we're going to feed this here over to our normal. So now we've just added just a little bit more subtle detail. Now we've got some of this wood grain into here. And that is going to take care of our small details. Now I think what I'm going to do is just play around a little bit with adding some of these crack lines here into our height. So let me grab a blend, because I want to control this separately. So here I'll grab that cracks, and again, it's the result from that directional warp. So again, it's been varied based on that luminance range from our Plancks, and we'll plug this into the foreground. And here, let's grab our height. Again, it's way back here in the graph, so instead of zooming all over the place, I'm just going to hold down the control key and left click to borrow it here from this blur and just plug it in. And then we'll come into here and we'll place multiply. And of course, we're going to lower that opacity quite a bit. Actually, you know what? I'm going to switch this up. I think a better way to kind of handle this. Let's come in here to our blur. So these are our Plancks in the background, and then we have our cracks in the foreground, and now we're adjusting the opacity. So this is going to let us kind of adjust the height range value for these crack lines here. And then also what I might do within this is grab a blur. This time I'm going to add kind of like this little cheaper blur here. And just let me reorder my connection points. So I'm going to hold down the control key, foreground. Let's plug this guy into here. So this is just blurring my cracks. And just slight blur here. And then we're going to take the result of that blur and place it into the foreground here of that blend. And then finally, we're going to send the output of this blend here into our height. So now here's what we're getting, and just a slight adjustment here to the opacity. So if we start to increase our opacity here, you can see now we're getting some more, just some extra depth here. So now this is kind of what our height looks like. Again, I'm using that blur to kind of get rid of some of that high frequency noise. Now I might go back here to my height, my normal intensity, and just play around with this a bit. So let's just set it to maybe 3. And kind of move my light around. I can also, since this is just my base material, I can play around here with my roughness value just so I can see, how this normal map is reacting to my light angle. All right, so it's looking pretty good so far. So let's just increase our roughness value, and we'll just kind of move these guys out of the way, and that's going to be, like I said, our small details. Now, if we look down here in our section, you can see that everything we've been doing so far, of course, has been grayscale. Now we have this final height result, and that's what we have right here. This is our final height, which is used specifically to generate our normal map, and we'll be using this to generate our ambient occlusion as well. However, it's not the height map that we're actually feeding into the shader. Again, that's kind of a more softer, kind of blurred version that you see here with a lot less noise in it. All right, so now that we kind of have that in place, let's take this grayscale kind of frame and just put this over top of everything, just so we can keep this well organized, and you can see how the process is working so far. So again, we've got grayscale, basic shape, large, medium, then we work to small details, and then this is our final kind of result that we have so far.